All right, welcome everybody. We're doing a little video here on the discriminant. Okay, the discriminant is weird, right? We don't like discrimination, that's for sure. When it comes to discrimination, though, that has to do with separating things and talking about how racial discrimination or economic discrimination, right? In math, obviously, we're not talking about those big social economic issues. We're talking about numbers and answers. So the discriminant has to do with telling answers apart, okay? And being able to discriminate between good answers and bad answers, or weird answers and normal answers, okay? Now, if we look at the quadratic formula, okay, I'll write it here. You don't have to write this, but if we look at the quadratic formula, negative b plus minus square root b squared minus 4ac over 2a, that's supposed to be an a. There's one place in particular that is going to tell us if we're going to have imaginary answers, right? Does this b have anything to do with us having imaginary answers? No. I don't care if this b is 100 or 5 or 2 or 1. It's not going to be imaginary. Is this 2a going to tell us about imaginary numbers? No. Because it's just going to be a 2a. But this part inside here, this part does have to do with imaginary answers, right? If this part right here is the square root of a negative number, we will have imaginary answers. And so the discriminant is little d equals b squared minus 4ac. Okay? It is literally the same thing that is on the inside of the square root of the quadratic formula. And that is because this part right here tells us if we're going to have real answers or not. So let's look at this. Okay? Obviously, we have a bunch of different values here. If our discriminant, that's this little d here, is less than 0, that means our discriminant is like a negative 5. If we have the square root of negative 5, what type of answers are we going to have? Real answers or imaginary answers? We're going to have imaginary answers, okay? And remember, it's also kind of complex. Complex numbers is just a number that's partly real and partly imaginary. So you need to kind of know both of these. And how many of them are we going to have? 2, because we're always going to have 2 answers when it comes to quadratic answers, because your highest exponents are 2, we're going to have 2 answers. Now, what happens if our discriminant is positive? Well, if our discriminant is positive, we're going to have real roots. Okay? And this one also says discriminant's positive, so we're going to get real roots. And this one says if your discriminant is equal to 0. Now, we haven't really done enough examples to have a very clear picture of what's going on here. Okay? Now, we did do some of these. What happens if your discriminant is bigger than 0, but you're not a perfect square? Okay, that's like a lot of the questions that we did, okay, where you would have something like, 2 plus minus the square root of 20 over 5. Okay, the 20 gets reduced a little bit, but we're still going to have 2 real answers. Okay, we've done questions like this, so we should have 2 real answers for sure. Go ahead and erase this. Now, what we haven't seen is what happens if we have a perfect square as our discriminant, right? What happens if we have, and I'm just making up a question here, 3 plus or minus 16 over 2. Again, I'm just making this up. What happens here? Well, what's the square root of 16? So we have 3 plus or minus 4 over 2. And what's weird about this is that our square root is gone, right? And now, can we do 3 plus 4? Yeah. So actually, this question right here is going to give us two answers that are regular old numbers. 3 plus 4 is 7 divided by 2, so we'll get 7 divided by 2. And that was the plus. Now we're going to use the minus. 3 minus 4, negative 1, divided by 2. And so we'll get 2 real answers. And these will just be regular old numbers. If we have perfect square, what that really means is that we should have just factored the question. Okay? We didn't see any of those in our notes because we checked for factoring every time. Okay? If you do quadratic formula when you could have factored, you're going to get a perfect square number and the square root will go away. Now, what happens if your discriminant is 0, though, right? We haven't seen that yet, so let's check out what happens. So, if our discriminant is 0, we're going to have, again, I'm just making up some numbers here. 5 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 3. Well, what's the square root of 0? Just 0, you're right. So that would be 5 plus or minus 0 over 3. Well, again, the square root has gone away, right? Can we do 5 plus 0? Yep, it's just 5. 5/3. Can we do 5 minus 0? It's just 5/3. So weirdly enough, if we get 0 as our discriminant, we're going to get two answers, but it's actually really like one answer because they're going to be the same. So in our chart here, number of roots, this one's kind of weird. It's 1, but it's kind of like we have 2 of the same. So you probably want to kind of keep that in mind. And it's going to be a real number as well. So, all that kept in mind, let's go back to what we're talking about here. The discriminant, which is the inside of the square root, is good at telling us what type of answers we will have. It's not good at telling us what the answers will be, but if we know what the discriminant is, we know what type of answers we will have. So, look at this question. It says, find the value of the discriminant and then determine the number and type of roots. It's not asking us for the actual answers. It just wants to know, do we have real answers or do we have imaginary answers, right? And so we don't need to do the whole thing. We can just focus on the discriminant. And we can say b squared minus 4ac. That would be b squared minus 4 times a times c. And then we could do this math, right? 12 squared is 144. Minus, plus, minus. That's going to make a plus. Doing this in a calculator isn't too hard. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 13 is 104. And so our discriminant is 248. Now, what does this tell us? It's not the answer to the question, but we know we have the square root of a positive number. And if we have the square root of a positive number, that's fine. That means we're going to have 2 real answers. Nothing to stress out about. Okay, we just get 2 real answers. We're fine. Let's look at a question like number 3. We want everything on one side. I'm going to move everything to that side. Wow, these numbers are pretty big. My first thought is, let's see if we can move everything to one side. That's going to be a positive 4x squared. Still a positive 10, because this one didn't move at all. but a negative 84 because I had to subtract that. And I see that all three of these also can be divided by 2, right? And I don't want to have to deal with these giant numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and make these numbers smaller by dividing by 2. And now I can do the discriminant, which would be b squared minus 4ac, which would be 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 42, which would be 25 minus plus minus is going to be a plus. And then I've got, 4 times 42 is 168. 2 times 168 is 336. Anyways, I know this is going to be a positive plus a positive, and so I know this is going to be 2 real answers. I don't know what the answers are, but I know I don't have to worry about imaginary answers. Now, finally, a question like number 4, where we need b squared minus 4ac. Remember that b is missing, so b is 0, right? I have no x terms here. b is gone. So I've got 0 minus 4 times a times c. This right here is going to be 0 minus a number, so I know it's going to be not good. Okay, that would be 12 times 24, which would be 288, and that would be negative 288. Now, negative 288 is a negative number, and in the grand scheme of things, it's going to look like this: negative b plus or minus the square root over 2a. And in the grand scheme of things, this is going to be bad. This is going to give us imaginary answers. And so our sneak peek, trying to focus only on this, has told us 2 complex answers, which is, kind of the same thing as imaginary. Okay, so that's the discriminant, okay? It's not good at telling you the answers, but it's good at giving you a sneak peek at whether you're going to get real answers or imaginary answers, okay? If a question is only asking you to tell you the type, you don't have to do the whole process. You can just take the sneak peek and use this to help you out. So that's all the notes we're going to take on discriminant. Hope this helps.